Hello, my name is Gary Henderson and I am the Director of IT at Millfield, a large co-ed boarding school in Somerset in the UK. Now, having been a teacher and through middle leader, senior leadership, and now in my more technology focused role, I've long been a believer in the importance of data and its use in data-driven decision making. And actually, that was one of the topics which I delivered professional development training on in the Middle East when I was working out there. But I think it's really, really important that we see the balance in both the positive potential in data, but also some of the risks and challenges. So, I mean, what is data-driven decision making? What is the use of data within schools? Well, it is basically, the gathering, organizing, storing, and using educational data to help us in our decision making and in driving education forward, improving outcomes, improving the student experience, etc. Now, in terms of the data, there are multiple types of data. There is the quantitative data that we're very, very used to, which is things like exam scores, attendance percentages, standardized testing scores, those kind of quantifiable results that we can easily do comparisons on. We can create an average, we can look at performance changes over time, etc. But then there's also what I would say is the more difficult type of data to manage, but sometimes the more interesting and nuanced data, which is that qualitative data. So, that might be, observations, that might be as part of a lesson walkthrough or lesson observations. It could be feedback from student surveys or staff perception surveys, where the questions, rather than being, rate this 1 to 10 or yes, no, being, what ways could we improve? What are the areas of in need of improvement? What suggestions do you have? That kind of more qualitative data. Now, the thing is, within schools, there are loads of sources for data. There is the stuff we gather already, which ends up in the management information system. There is the potential to have focus groups and discussions, to put out surveys, to get the community's feedback, to ask parents their view. There are lots and lots of sources for the data. But what do we do with that data once we've got it? It is about, looking at, what are the kind of trends and patterns? Are things improving over time? Are things getting worse over time? Have new issues arisen? New areas for concern or new strengths? And looking at that kind of thing. What are the trends? What are the patterns? What are the anomalies? And I think that is sometimes interesting. I think sometimes we look at the trends and the patterns, but what we don't look at or don't consider is, what doesn't the data say? So what are our blind spots? And I think that's just as worth being considered and being looked at. But in gathering all that data and looking at the trends, etc., hopefully we can then set, our plans regarding, how we can improve the situation based on the data. And I think the one thing that I think is quite important here is, data-driven decision making almost suggests that the data drives the decisions. But for me, the reality is it's cyclic. So yes, data potentially can drive decisions. So based on data, we might identify that there's an area for development that we might want to address. And therefore we put actions in place based on what the data has told us. But from there, what that then should do is it should then drive how do we know that we've had the impact we want? What data do we need to gather to show whether we've made the progress we wanted to make? And that's where it is almost, data can drive decision making, but then decision making drives the data we gather, which then drives the next decision. And it's that kind of iterative process. And I think a big question in there in terms of decision making is that if we are making decisions about something, how do we know it works? So if we've decided to take a particular action, implement one-to-one devices or implement a new SEND program or something like that, how do we know that it's going to work? What is the data that we will gather that will help us to identify whether that change is actually a success? So there is great potential with using data to drive things forward, but I think there are a couple of risks and challenges I think we have to consider. We have to consider that as we gather more data to help us make our decisions, what is the security of that data? How are we keeping it secure? What is the privacy of that data, data protection requirements? So in the UK, one of the things we've got to consider is the General Data Protection Regulation, and is there a clear purpose for our gathering of data, and is that proportionate to the individual's privacy? So we can't gather too much data, be too intrusive in relation to what we're doing here. So we have to consider that data protection, that information security. We have to consider context. And I think all too often I see data being compared, school X compared to school Y, or country X compared to country Y. The reality is that each school operates in a different context, and it is nigh on impossible to sort of compare directly one school with another, because their strategy might be different, their intake of students might be different, their focus and strategic objectives might be different. So I think one thing I think we have to be careful of, that data doesn't tell us anything. Data exists with some context. So our score might be, the score for year 10 this year in terms of the average score for students in an English exam is better than last year. But what's the context? Were the students comparable? Were the number of students comparable? Were the number of students with EHCPs or SEND needs, were they comparable? Understanding that context, and that sort of hints to my other bit, that we do live in a somewhat messy world. I do think there's a danger that in seeking to do data-driven decision making, that we gather too much data, and if we gather too much data, then we can't see the wood for the trees. We've got so much data we can't actually make intelligible sense of it, and I think there's a balance to be had there. And probably one of my last concerns is that sometimes we gather data and it becomes what's important. So exam results and league tables become what's important. So in other words, what we can measure becomes what matters. Actually, in data-driven decision making, what we should be doing is working out what matters and then measuring it. So measuring what matters rather than what matters is what we can measure. Now, I think that's a concern we have to kind of look at. So if I was to finish up, and just give some quick suggestions on, what to do. I think for me, in looking to manage data, I think one of my first suggestions is work out what data you've already got. There's no point spending a lot of time gathering new data and the workload that might require. Look at what you've got already. Look at what it tells you and how you might be able to use it. Also look at any data you're gathering that you don't need, and in which case, why gather it? So stop gathering it and save the workload. So look at what you've got, look at what it shows, and look at how you can do that first before you then start considering what additional data you might be able to gather. Start with what you've already got. Now, I hope, as I say, those are just some initial thoughts and a brief and quick rundown considering data-driven decision making. So I hope that was quite useful.